So hello there. Welcome to sort of today's talk in our music industry insight sessions. And today I'm going to go through some of the funding that's available for artists and music organisations, and some other opportunities, other sort of developmental opportunities that are available to kind of people in Yorkshire to develop their projects a little bit more. So, if this is the first time you've been to one of these talks, this is the fourth talk out of five that we're doing. We're doing them weekly through July, and the last talk is going to be next week, which is going to focus on kind of approaching live opportunities and getting gigs and getting out there. They've been covered by a combination of myself and other Launchpad advisors. And if you are watching this, and hopefully you've signed up, if you there should be resources available, for this. So we've been sending out with the registration, we've been sending out packs of the PDF slides and recordings of all these sessions. So if you are watching this back later and you haven't got access to that, do drop us a line through the Launchpad website, which assumably will be linked somewhere within this. Again, if you've not met me before, I run the Launchpad project. I'm the director of the organisation Music Leads Local. Everyone calls me Whiskas. My real name is Sam. I've done quite a lot of things in the music sector to kind of bring me to this point. I previously ran a record label, being a touring and recording musician, even worked as a producer, ran a music venue for a short time, quite a few years ago now. I also helped set up the BA Music Industries Management course at Leeds Beckett University, where I still lecture kind of one and a half days a week on all of that. And I suppose one of the crucial bits for today is that I'm also lucky enough to act as an advisor for a lot of funding bodies in the UK, so specifically PRS Foundation, Help Musicians UK, and News Music. And by that, it means that I quite often sit on funding panels, which is a combination of people will kind of talk through applications that have been made to a number of the funds that I'm going to talk about today. Which is great. I think those funders do a really good job in terms of bringing a wide range of people into those panels with different experiences. And certainly, like, I've been brought into that over the last, I suppose, 5 to 10 years to give maybe a bit of a northern perspective and kind of talk about kind of like how artists, what support they need when they don't necessarily have as much access to kind of the London music industry, shall we say. And the process is really great. I'm able to kind of feed that into some of the decision-making processes, but also I'm able to kind of glean from other people, other advisors, in terms of what looks like a good project, what kind of comes across well. And that's part of what we do with Launchpad, really, is being able to support on some of that, really, and advise the people that we're supporting in terms of the best way to approach some of these funds and other opportunities as well. So I'll be feeding that obviously into a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So one thing I will say is there will be a lot of talk today about funding, sort of getting cash to help develop your project. But towards the end as well, we'll look at kind of other opportunities that are available that are able to develop, because there is a lot more kind of regional and maybe even genre specific stuff that isn't necessarily about cash funding. And depending on where you're at with your career, that will mean different things to you. Now, one of the things about the kind of funding we're going to talk about today through these organisations is it's helping support artists to be more independent, make more creative choices. Now, a lot of these artists, you'll see me name names that are signed to bigger labels and have gone on to do big things. I think, one of the big examples from one of the big funders is having worked with, say, Years and Years. But of course, what it does at the early stage, it allows an artist to maybe go at their own pace a little bit more, make more interesting creative decisions. And that's really, I think, how you should sort of approach what these funders are about. It isn't necessarily just to do business as usual. It's to allow you a bit more scope to develop your project and grow your career. Again, something we'll come back to. All the funds have a slightly different focus, but some of them are definitely about building it as a business as well, about being more secure, because they want to give you funding so that you are more sustainable, so you are able to fund yourself more. So that has to be taken into account. And obviously, as I go through all the different kinds of funding available, I will sort of break that down and highlight where that takes place. Some kind of key bits of advice when you're looking at funding, really, before we kind of get started in some of the specifics. Success often depends on the timing and the project fit. So I'm going to go through quite a lot of different funds that broadly also support music projects, but they're all looking to get something slightly different out of it. And so a project that you are hoping to get funding for may well sit much better with one fund than another. That sort of, maybe that's obvious, but it's worth having that overview. It might even be that thinking ahead, you think about how your project can maybe, work in a certain way so it can more directly align with what a funder wants. I will talk a little bit about Arts Council, but Arts Council have a very, very defined strategy. And so, projects to be funded by Arts Council, need to fit within that strategy. Funding also depends a lot on timing as well. We've just supported an artist to get a really, really great funding bid, a sort of maybe second or third attempt. And there was a big feeling between us and him that the success has come because it's actually the right time. And then the last application round, he didn't quite have ducks in a row, and it wasn't quite at the right stage to get it. And sometimes being rejected is almost part of the process if it forces you to come up with a better plan and do things in a different way. It's specifically difficult where it comes in terms of, if you imagine an album project, quite often it's about at what point in that cycle you are you're looking for that funding in terms of having the maximum impact. And again, I'll touch on all of these as we talk about specific funds. But ultimately, this page of advice kind of rings true across the board. You can have a great project, but the timing doesn't work or the objectives don't align with the funder's priorities. And hopefully that will become clear as we talk about each specific project. One of the key things that we do through the kind of advice sessions and the mentoring we do through Launchpad is the first step with any artist is to kind of come up with a plan, a plan of kind of developing your project, which, commonly would be kind of, an album or a kind of substantive EP. If you've got that plan in place and there is enough time to develop it effectively and react to things within it, then usually you can look at how you adapt it for different kinds of funding. And again, I hope that'll become slightly clear as we kind of run through these slides. So the first half of the talk today, I'm really going to focus around these 4 national funders. These are the 4 main national funding bodies that support like the creation of new music in the UK. They all, as I said, they all have slightly different remits and slightly different criteria. Some of it's obvious, so like youth music is to support people 25 and under. But you'll see some alignment, and we'll break down like kind of what each organisation does. So I'm going to start with PRS Foundation. So PRS Foundation are the UK's leading charitable funder of new music and talent development. They are the kind of core, purely music-specific funder. They are a different organisation to PRS for music that collects royalties. They are obviously connected, but they are spun out as an independent organisation. But their remit is to support music creators because it is about that kind of compositional element as well. So it is generally about when new music is being written and created and then obviously being released. They have an absolutely fantastic track record of supporting artists and really, really diverse genres and stuff, as we'll kind of touch upon. But as I already mentioned about years and years, artists that have really kind of become really quite huge. And as I said, I think what the important thing to recognise is that at an early stage in their careers, this fund allowed artists to make more creative choices and develop their career in their own way before they committed to working with a kind of bigger music industry body. So PRS Foundation actually has a lot of different funds, and I'll break down most of them today. Some I'll go into more detail than others. The headline too that it has a lot of focus is the Momentum and Momentum Accelerator Funds, which I'll go through in a minute. And those are the ones that a lot of the names on the previous page, that is what they were successful with. Their kind of main catch-all fund is called the Open Fund, and there's a version for music creators and for organisations. And sort of attached to that, because it's got similar, pretty much the same criteria, is the Women Make Music fund as well, which is obviously specifically for women and people of marginalised genders. Following the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, they also launched the Power Up program, which is to empower Black music creators and industry professionals as well. I'll touch upon that. And I suppose one of the interesting things for people who are making maybe slightly different kinds of music are they're other targeted and maybe genre specific funds. So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the Hitmaker Fund for producers, the Composers Fund for composers, and the Orem Awards, which works with experimental sound-based artists who are female or of marginalised gender as well. So Momentum Fund is the really, really big one, basically. And this is, I was going to say this isn't aimed at emerging artists. It is aimed at artists who are at a tipping point. So this is for artists who already have an existing track record. They've already done things within the industry. Generally, one of the criteria, if you look into the details, is that they've got a team in place. They are basically ready to go. And this money, the funding that this will kind of allow them to kind of make that impact to get into place. A good way, I think, to think about Momentum Fund is the idea of this fund is once you've got it, you hopefully don't need to come back in for funding again. It really sets you up. Now, obviously, that's quite ambitious and, you know, that doesn't always work, but that is the intention of this fund. And this is kind of at the top of the pile. And the point is, we'll look at what some of the kind of more funds for earlier career are, for sure. It is up to £15,000. There are, I think there's 3 or 4 deadlines a year. PRS Foundation is still kind of like a lot of people. It's in a sort of slightly changeable nature post COVID. That it is open at the minute, so there is a deadline on the 18th of August. The next one, and just to give you an idea of some of the artists from the region that have been successful through this. So Yard Act more recently, Marsikins, Life, Hookworms, kind of goes back about. I think it's been running for 10 years now. So this quite often is a fund to kind of aim for in the future, but being aware that it's there is super helpful. Next, I'll talk about the Momentum Accelerator Fund. Now, this is a fund specific to regions in the UK. So it's currently run in Wales, in Liverpool, and in Yorkshire. So ourselves in Liverpool pretty much piloted this a few years ago. And the idea is that it is a stepping stone to that full Momentum Fund. Because if the idea of that full Momentum Fund is you are ready to go, you've got a team together, then what was recognised a few years ago is that actually you are disadvantaged then if you're not working in the kind of London mainstream music industry, or you haven't naturally found that partner in a kind of manager or a record label. So this fund demonstrating the interest in doing that, and again allowing you to make creative decisions and that stepping stone to get up to that next point. We've had a lot of success with this in Yorkshire. I think we've run 5 rounds of it now, I want to say. Unfortunately, due to the funding that funds this, it's gone down from being 2 rounds a year to just one round a year at the minute, although, you know, we've put in some funding to reinstate that next year. And yes, again, one thing to mention about both these funds, and I've obviously got a specific knowledge of this accelerator fund because Launchpad are the funding partner on it, is they are highly competitive. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of percentages in this, but I think in the last round of Momentum Accelerator Fund, we had 60 applicants, 60 something applicants, of which we're only able to fund 2 people. So that is a kind of 1 in 3. No, not 1 in 3, 3%. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think 3%. Should have done those maths before I got on this call. It's quite hard to get. It is very competitive, and sort of the sad thing to mention about something like this is that, of course, lots of very, very good artists with perfectly good plans weren't successful because their budget is not there to fund all of them. And with a fund like this, that is something to recognise in terms of confidence and validation and stuff. And I'll try and touch on how that affects some of the other funding as well. And again, Momentum runs a few times a year. This won't, we think, run until next year again. We're currently waiting on some funding decisions. But yeah, keep an eye out for it, and obviously we'll be shouting about it quite a lot when it's open. As I said, the main catch-all funds from through PRS Foundation are the open fund, and as I said, we do kind of lump Women Make Music in on that because a lot of the criteria and the forms are the same in this, and they sort of do what they say in the tin. They fund organisations or music creators. They're about projects. Women Make Music is about women, trans and non-binary people making projects. So they can be a big catch-all, and they can again be that stepping stone for something like Momentum as well. Again, unfortunately, these are highly competitive with kind of single figure percentage success rates. But if people have the energy to kind of approach these funds, you know, good projects will come out. They often will be kind of briefings on like how to approach them. There's been a lot of work done recently in terms of streamlining the applications. And again, like I said in that first slide, if you've got a plan that you're kind of going to do anyway, and you can see how you can upstream it and downstream it to benefit from different funding, and you've got the energy to apply for this funding, then you know there's nothing to lose if you've got the energy to put that in. Well, one thing about the open fund and Women Make Music is these deadlines are in September now. And these are one of the more regular rounds as well. So there's 3 or 4 rounds of this per year. But again, they're splitting it out a little bit and it's changing. So we are kind of coming to the end of the funding year now, and there will be a new round of dates announced kind of later in the year for what's happening in 2024. So I mentioned earlier about kind of genre specific or targeted funds. And I'll just do a kind of brief overview on these. I'm not going to do a deep dive, but if these hit you, hit your sort of demographic or the kind of things that you're making, they're really good funds. So the first one is the Hitmaker Fund, and that is a fund aimed at kind of producer songwriters. So people kind of behind the glass, people who are not kind of frontline artists, but are producing and making music with other people. And it's around allowing you to kind of collaborate and spend time working with other people. The Composers Fund is kind of for more, I was going to say traditional composers, but I only mean that in terms of, again, they're maybe not kind of frontline artists, but they are working more in the classical or neoclassical field in terms of developing work and, again, writing for kind of other ensembles or other people. The Orem Awards, I'm just sorry, apologies, that date is wrong. The Orem Awards deadline is the 14th of August. And the Orem Awards is a really interesting one. So that is for artists, female and marginalised gender artists who are making kind of experimental sound work. So it's inspired by Daphne Oram, who I believe worked with Delia Derbyshire. Nick Nack, who is a supported artist from Launchpad, was successful in the Orem Awards, I think either last year or maybe the year before. And I know we kind of got a lot of support through them because it's kind of a little bit of funding and a little bit of kind of like mentoring and support as well. So if you're making music in that mold, that is really worth doing. And again, I think that works slightly different because of the nature. It's called the Orem Awards, but it's kind of a funding and developmental opportunity. It's not quite the same in terms of like, what's your plan? What are you going to use the money for? It's more about where are you at in terms of your career. And then the final one to mention is Power Up, which is obviously a fantastic program and has quite a lot of funding attached to it. It's a sort of addition here in a way because it's just been announced that's not going to run again until early 2024. This is the fund that supports Black music creators and Black music professionals. It's just announced it's like a 3rd-year cohort. Again, there's a number of people from Yorkshire, the North, that have been on it over the last couple of years, like August Charles, Graft, who've been on it. And so again, it's about kind of thinking about kind of adversity in terms of the music industry and empowering through a kind of collective learning as well. So that's one to look out for next year. And again, if that fits what you're doing, it's definitely worth looking at where that fits in terms of the timeline for any kind of plans that you might be developing. And that's pretty much it in terms of PRS Foundation, in terms of that general overview. They do some other funds, some other call outs that are very specific around things like Biennale. So obviously always worth looking at them. But those are the kind of main things to be looking out for in terms of how you might get funding. So the next fund I'm going to talk about is Help Musicians. And Help Musicians have done a lot of work over the last few years to develop a kind of a core suite of funding opportunities to impact specifically musicians. So again, where I talked about PRS Foundation is specifically around creators. Help Musicians is about musicians, and of course, many of you will be both of those. But Help Musicians is specifically about that. It's the leading UK charity for musicians. It works across all kinds of genres, and again, as a lot of people at the minute, it's very keen to kind of diversify what that means. It's, as we'll see, it's kind of got a number of targeted programs that are specifically in genres like jazz and opera. One of the big things about Help Musicians, as I said, in terms of the way it's restructured its fund, is there's a lot of, as you will see, it does what it says on the tin. But the big difference with Help Musicians is their funds are currently always open. They're open on a rolling basis, so you can apply at any time. That means there are no deadlines. You can kind of apply at your own speed. The big thing to mention is that the projects still have about a 3-month turnaround. So even though you can apply whenever you want, the date of which the things that you're applying for really have to start at least 3 months from the point in which you submit. And I go to great pains to make that point, because it's one of the main reasons stuff doesn't get funded. And the other point to make by that is, while it is great that they're always open, in our experience supporting artists, it often makes it hard for artists applying to put their own deadline in place. You can start writing it with a plan, and then easily you don't submit it in time, and you have to rewrite bits of it because it's closer than 3 months apart. So it's great that it's always open, but you sort of have to very much self-manage the process of submitting so that you keep it on track and it doesn't just get pushed further and further away. A couple of other things to mention: it, unlike some other funders, it has from our experience, it has quite a good success rate. Partly because it's able to manage its funding in that way. And there's a lot of support as well internally within Help Musicians. So they do these things called Get Set sessions each month for new applicants that kind of give sort of general guidance and advice. And I'll put a few links to Launchpad's website at the end, but there's links there to do that. And again, there's feedback that if artists are kind of having a talk with people at Help Musicians before applying, they're kind of more likely to be successful as well. So what kind of things are available for Help Musicians? So they sort of brand their funding up through their creative program. And there's 4 main funds that you can go for, 4 or 5, because kind of do. So there is the recording and releasing music funds, and then there's also the Mobile Help Musicians Fund, and they both kind of do the same thing in terms of supporting recording and releasing music. Obviously, the Mobo Fund is specifically for artists making what Mobo would define as music of Black origin. But they basically both provide a pot of £3,000 for creative projects and artist development. That can include things like, recording costs, mixing, mastering costs, promotional costs, so things like paying for PR, paying for radio plugging, paying for marketing, and all the things kind of involved in that. Those are kind of the core components. Maybe production of records as well is another one. If you want to kind of produce vinyl, it can kind of support funding for things like that. And as I say, that is for both the recording and releasing fund and the Mobile Help Musicians Fund. Relatively new fund, although I think it's been running for just over a year now, is the Touring and Live Fund. So that supports up to £5,000 to support touring and live activity. So one of the barriers again, you can obviously imagine the kind of things that would support in terms of petrol, travel costs, accommodation costs, production costs and things like that. One of the barriers we found for doing this is if your tour isn't kind of locked down early enough, it perhaps doesn't look as strong. So in an ideal world, you want the dates that you're looking for support for done 5 or 6 months in advance, and then to be able to go into the funding and obviously then benefit from the funding you would receive from that. But obviously, as we know, with the Best Way in the World tours are probably booked about 3 or 4 months in advance, which then doesn't give you the time to put a bid together. And actually, quite often there can be odd bits and pieces kind of chipping in for that quite late. But it's a really great fund. It's one of the only ones, if not the only one, that really looks at supporting in that way. A couple of other sort of overlooked funds through Help Musicians, and a massive shout out for the top one, Develop Your Skills, especially if you're early in your career. you're actually still working out how to piece a plan together, or like what you need to do. Because effectively, we develop your skills. It can give you up to £1.5 grand to get mentoring, coaching, go to workshops to improve your musicianship or marketing or production skills, and develop conferences and stuff. So again, it's a really, really great thing to kind of look into how that might support you. Again, if you're working to get to the point of doing other funding bids. And then the last one is called the Music-Led Creative Collaboration, which is about developing collaborative projects with non-musicians, which does what it says on the tin again. Again, I'm speaking to people that are not always sure how to approach that one, but again, it might be something that you're actively doing anyway, and can provide quite a good opportunity to that. One of the things not mentioned here is you can apply for a combination of these funds, but always only up to £5,000. So you can actually apply for the recording and releasing and develop your skills together, or you can apply for recording, releasing and touring together. I think the thing about that last example is you can still only apply for up to £5,000, I believe. So yeah, something to consider. But it doesn't necessarily mean you can kind of suddenly apply for like a lot more money from these things. As mentioned, Help Musicians also has a number of specific funds to do with jazz, musical theatre, opera specifically. I don't think any of these are open at the minute. These are time bound because they tend to run kind of like once a year, I believe. The Peter Whittingham Jazz Award, for anyone, we work with a lot of jazz artists through Launchpad. I'm sure I think there's 2 or 3 who've been successful with that jazz award in the past. So if you are making jazz, working in the jazz genre, that one is definitely worth being aware of and looking out for when that gets launched. Also, for any of you looking at further education, then I would suggest there are kind of funding to help you with postgraduate awards as well, and that's generally around musicianship. Okay, so going to talk about Youth Music now. So Youth Music are a fantastic funder and national charity that supports children and young people aged 0 to 25 to make music and build careers in the industry. And again, one of the things that's often overlooked is it does have a substantial amount of support for those aged 18 to 25. As well as the funding, I really, really like to make the point that there are some fantastic resources on their website. They are fantastic at leveraging support through other artists and musicians. So we work with an artist supported through them who's received a lot of support from the electronic artist Bicep, who are kind of one of their ambassadors. So they're really, really great at connecting all those things. And there's a lot of guys like all these resources that are listed on this page. It's worth noting that primarily Youth Music supports other organisations, not specifically musicians, with the caveat of one fund. And I mentioned that not to be kind of negative, but the fact that there are loads of Youth Music funded organisations around. Later on, towards the end of today, I'll kind of break down other kind of more regional organisations, and most of those have Youth Music funding as well. There is a map and a network thing on the website, which is linked here, which also has a link to all those organisations. So, actually, before I go on to this, another caveat with Youth Music. So I'm going to run through the funds that Youth Music deliver. The caveat is right now, Youth Music has paused all of its funding until 2024. It is going through a review in terms of the best way to distribute this and make their funds more accessible. Some stuff, there's still quite a lot of information on the website. And I was speaking to some of the team last week, and the plan is that all of this will return in 2024. So I am going to talk about it as something to kind of look out for and be aware of. But unfortunately, for the next few months, it's not available to kind of go for. But as I say, in terms of the landscape, I wanted to include it anyway. So the main fund for music makers is the Next Gen Fund, which offers young creatives grants of up to £2,500. And those things can either be creative artistic, so developing their musical projects, but also like music businesses, so collectives, radio stations, record labels, and things like that. So that is for people aged 18 to 25. And again, we've had really good success through with artists that we work with through this. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few, but Maddie Morris, George Bloomfield, Gemini Elia, all kind of successful through this fund to kind of give them some support to help make music. So all the other funds through Youth Music are going to be organisation based, but again, I will mention them. So if you're an artist, most people live on this call are artists, I believe. But again, it's so you're aware of the kind of wider landscape or any organisations watching this later. So the other fund that is aimed specifically at 18 to 25s, which is very kind of industry focused, is the Incubator Fund. So you may or may not realise, but this has powered a number of projects in the region over the last 2 or 3 years that it's run. So we've had funding for this to help run our Bradford Young Promoters Scheme. This has supported Come Play With Me. The Long Division team has been empowered through this. BCB Radio, All Stars Entertainment in Bradford, Young Thugs, I think Level Up project was funded through this. So really, really great, and it's given a lot of people really, really fab opportunities to develop their projects with this fund. Again, it's paused. Hope it's planned to return, I believe, in 2024. So again, keep an eye out for that. Or again, if you're not an organisation but you are working with organisations, and again, really interesting about this fund is it's not necessarily aimed at not-for-profits. A lot of the idea is that it's for music industry organisations to help support career opportunities for young people. So again, if you're working with organisations, you may want to make them aware of this to be able to apply for when it reopens. The main two kind of core bits of funding that Youth Music kind of offer are the Trailblazer and Catalyst Fund. And the first one's up to 30,000, and Catalyst Fund is over 30,000. And this kind of supports children and young people to kind of support kind of continuation of music making. The Catalyst Fund is the kind of one of the core elements that supports our Launchpad program over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, in fact. So again, this is for kind of chunkier pieces of work, more strategic for organisations. Again, both of these paused until 2024. These have, I think, more specific return dates if you actually check out the Youth Music website. So finally, on to the last of these national funders, and kind of undoubtedly the biggest, which is Arts Council England. So if you're not aware of Arts Council England, this is the kind of core strategic organisation that funds cultural activity and arts activity in England. The reason it's England is there are equivalents in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. It actually pulls most of its funding from the National Lottery, but the core organisations, which are called National Portfolio Organisations or NPOs, are funded directly from government. I'm going to focus today on 2 funds from Arts Council England: project grants and developing your creative practice. I would also say that Arts Council England are also very good at doing outreach events. So they will have regular briefings in terms of how to apply for both of these funds as well. We've on our Launchpad website, we have webinars from Arts Council about how to apply to these, although I would caveat that they are maybe slightly out of date now. They're certainly from a couple of years ago. Some things will be the same, core ideology will be the same, but other things will obviously have changed as these things have developed. But I'm going to give you a brief overview now. Kind of talked about this, yeah, as well as the fact that the Arts Council is kind of a lot of the funding comes from National Lottery. I mentioned this at the start, is that the Arts Council has developed a really strong cultural strategy called Let's Create a few years ago, which is about this quote: to make sure everyone's creativity is given the chance to flourish and we all have access to a remarkable range of high quality cultural experiences. And that really permeates specifically project grants, I would say. I think there's a developing your creative practice, again, does what it says on the tin. That project grants is not always a direct fit for emerging artists developing projects. And that's where developing a creative practice can come from. But one of the key things when you're applying to Arts Council England is to really understand their strategy and sort of, as much as possible, ensure that it is a good fit within what they are trying to achieve in terms of the creative vision within the country. So project grants specifically, with that caveat, is project grants is for projects. They can be useful for touring projects, creating interactive live events, projects, installations, and critical pieces of work. In the past, we've seen artists go and get funding for album projects and associated touring. That is still, viable, and we've heard some artists be able to get funding through that. But there is definitely an element of fitting into the strategy as well, in terms of how it's enabling kind of cultural experiences for all. One thing's for sure is if it is about a kind of specific activity, interactive events, co-production, that fits pretty neatly with Arts Council's strategy for sure. The main barrier to application through project grants for a lot of people is that the application form is a lot more involved than any of the other things that I've talked about before. There's quite comprehensive sections in terms of listing partners, listing budgets, confirming certain revenue shares and stuff. You have to address specific elements within the Let's Create strategy around their priorities and investment principles. So there is a required kind of understanding of what all those things are. And I say required understanding, I mean like reading the thing first. But that work needs to be put in to kind of enable you to put a good application together. For most of the things I've talked about so far, I haven't really talked about the applications, but they're essentially asking, who are you? What's the plan? How is the plan going to help you? With Arts Council, it's a bit more involved in that. It wants to know how the plan will impact on the strategy that it wants. So that can often be the barrier. The flip of that is the amount of money you can bid for and the turnaround is a lot slicker than some of the others. So, for example, you can apply for up to £30,000, which is, you might notice, is way more than any of the other things that we've talked about today. And there is just a 9-week turnaround. Although I would note that in busy, that can often stretch. Although they generally try and keep to what they're saying. It's another bit of a post-COVID thing in terms of, unfortunately, that's just stretched it a couple of times. So yeah, if you're going for £10,000, which is the equivalent of some of those bigger bids we've looked at today, that's relatively small within this over £30,000 amount. But again, I would say that this is generally aimed at organisations and kind of bigger projects as well. But it is worth looking at and being aware of for sure. The fund that's more likely to be relevant to creatives is developing your creative practice, which, as I said, does what it says on the till. It's about developing your art and creative work. We've seen many artists get support through this, a whole range of successful artists, from electronic musicians to sound artists to more traditional musicians. So there's a really good opportunity to get support through this fund. The key bit of feedback we hear is that it is about developing your work, developing your practice. It's not just about delivering a practice. And there is a nuance in terms of how you approach it in terms of that. It is not saying, I'm going to develop my work and make an album. It's about the journey, and you might just demonstrate that through creating an album, and you might do that on the side anyway. So it's just approaching it in the right way. But again, this application form is not as involved as for project grants. It is more in line with that. Who are you? What's the plan? How is it going to make a difference? So again, if you are seeing the need to develop your work, it's this process-driven thing. This is really good to look at. Unlike, I think I mentioned, project grants is always open. This one works in tranches, so it works in cycles. We're in the middle of a cycle at the minute, so the next deadline is the 10th of August, and then the next one will open in November with a deadline of the 14th of December. So yeah, this is a good one to look at. Again, I think a number of the Launchpad team have had this bid, and again, another point to make: it's not just artists and creators. We've had people get it as curators, as programmers, producers. If you were to replicate what we do in music in the theatre world, the equivalent of promoters have got this, because they, the producers of shows. So there's quite a lot of interesting things. Brings us to this next slide, which is one of the interesting things about Arts Council is it's very, very transparent, and all any previous funded artist or project is publicly available on their website. So if you're kind of interested in the kind of people, projects that are getting funded, you cannot see the applications, but you can see the names of the project and where they're based and things like that. Another thing I haven't mentioned actually that isn't on the slides is Arts Council also has a list of what are called priority places. So if you're based in one of these priority places, supposedly you get priority, or they are keen to fund more projects in those areas. And in Yorkshire, there are 4 local authority areas. That is Selby, Kirklees, Rotherham, and Barnsley. So any work in those places is viewed as a priority. So if that is for you, that might be worth thinking about. That might give you a bit of extra confidence. One little bit here, the NB Grantium, delay for approval, especially with those deadlines for developing your creative practices. In order to apply for a grant through Arts Council, you need to set up a profile on their grants system, which is called Grantium. That doesn't happen automatically. It's generally like a week to set up a profile. So again, if you are looking, certainly if you're looking at developing your creative practice, I would make sure you've got an account set up as soon as possible. And for anything else, it's just, again, you can't just get on the system straight away. So if you're looking at this, do plan ahead and just try and get that account set up so you can kind of see how to approach it. I haven't put any links in here with all these things. It's very, very Googleable, and I'd just have it covered with links if I had a link to each fund. But there's a lot of really big kind of how-to breakdown guides from Arts Council as well. There's like a hell of a lot of kind of support and breakdown. So again, don't underestimate that. And that kind of sums up really those four major kind of key funders that fund projects across the UK and England. And those are also the ones that obviously come with the most substantial amount of funding as well. And certainly with Launchpad, obviously, if we're trying to support an artist get to the next step, it's often through those kind of funds. Maybe start with Help Musicians, PRS Foundation, Arts Council Developing a Creative Practice. If they're younger youth music, we look at how they can kind of piece together a journey to support them through their kind of creative journey. So I was going to say the second half, this isn't really, don't worry, this isn't the second half. There's not like a whole same again. But I guess this last bit maybe sort of feels like a break. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the organisations and opportunities that are available more regionally and specifically in Yorkshire and the North, I would say, as well. And one of the best things to look in terms of regional support is through PRS Foundation's talent development partners. So you may be aware PRS Foundation supports about 50 organisations across the UK, and it's a real spread of genres and regions. We're really lucky in Yorkshire. There's quite a number of us who do it, and also it's quite genre diverse as well. So it's really worth looking at all these organisations for the support that they give to artists and organisations. And it's also worth looking regardless of genre. So things like Opera North and Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival support quite a broad range of artists as well. So each of these will have different schemes that run throughout the year that are both funded by PRS Foundation and other work as well. Alongside that, there's a number of other like local initiatives, like local organisations who do a lot of work to support artists. Some of this works in a similar way to what we do with Launchpad with call-outs. Some of it's like a bit more specific, based across the whole range of the system. And it might be things that something like Bradford Producing Hub is based in Bradford, but covers all kinds of like cultural genres. Things like Yorkshire Sound Women Network actually work all over the place, and obviously that's quite discreet in terms of what it does, in terms of supporting electronic music. But generally, like thinking about where you're based and what you're connecting with, and keeping an eye out for where these organisations possibly have schemes that are open. Again, this is probably less kind of like grant based, but it can offer opportunities around skills development, live performance opportunities, networking, and all kinds of other things as well. The other thing to think about is, again, I think on this call, we've got people from across Yorkshire here, is that many local authorities have small grant funding that allow you to develop projects, some of which allows you to develop artistic projects. And that really changes everywhere. So again, depending on where you're based, there might be council, local authority schemes that allow you to develop creative projects. Certainly kind of a pick on there, Wakefield has had quite a lot of like micro commissions over the last couple of years. Bradford is a slight outlier in terms of, obviously Bradford is going to become the UK City of Culture in 2025. So there's an increasing number of little pots of money through that. A lot of that comes through either Bradford 2025 or Bradford Producing Hub as well. But again, it's worth looking at the, again, I know we've got people from across Yorkshire. Where are you based? Is there a sort of thing on the local authority website? Is there an organisation in the city that's looking to kind of funnel that? It does that offer something. Again, often it's not going to be to maybe develop an album, but if it's like an event, a launch, something that's involved, there's usually something that might be open to you to pitch to. So talking about uh, geographically specific places, there's also quite a lot of genre specific organisations that are based both in the north and work nationally to do that. So jazz is again one of the more obvious things, partly because we've got Jazz North. So Jazz North supports jazz artists and promoters in the jazz scene in general across all the north, and run a number of schemes. The Northern Line scheme that supports like touring jazz artists across the north. But there are kind of all the others on that list: Jazz Refreshed, United Development, Sound of Music, Sound UK, based in London, but offer schemes, artist development opportunities, micro commissions that anyone across the UK can bid for. And there's a little nod to some other organisations in the north, in other parts of the north other than Yorkshire, but offer artist development opportunities across the north. So there's Generator based in the northeast. A lot of their schemes are northeast based, but they do some really great events that, again, if you're based in the north of Yorkshire, you might be able to go and attend. Really great conference. There's Brighter Sound that runs mentoring schemes across all the north. And the Sage and Gateshead, who are just about to do a summer series where they summer studios, sorry, where they open up their studios for artists to come in and use. And again, that's open to artists across the north. So again, it's worth looking at all those things. And I did a quick look in terms of what's available. Again, very much the point of Launchpad is if we hear of stuff that's available, we put it up on our website, on our opportunities page, our resources page. But many of the things I've mentioned is kind of been open to date. All the funding stuff that's there is listed on our page. There's some stuff that's just come up at the minute. It's sort of time limited, just to give you an idea of kind of things that are available. So Help Musicians are currently running business skills for musicians workshops that you can tap into. Non-Classical, which is another kind of PRS funded organisation, they're running a composer scheme at the minute. And again, I mentioned the artist Nick Knack. She has been working on that, I think, last year through maybe last year's scheme or something similar. It's not always traditional funders. It's Dr. Martin's running an alternative platform, like a Play to Play live opportunities thing. At the minute, I haven't really talked about like Festival of Play to Play as part of this, but that certainly comes up a lot. Obviously, not so much now because all the festivals are booked, but where they are, keep an eye out. We obviously post them. And probably one of the kind of core artist development opportunities that is out there at the minute is Resonance from Opera North, which again works with artists from very different genres, primarily Black and people of colour. But that is open for support as well at the minute. And so links and details to that are all listed on the Launchpad website. We will always try and list them. Well, anything we find out, we'll give it a shout out on socials. But just to give you an idea of the kind of things that are out there, those are out there, like right now. And the final thing I always like to shout up, to just not forget about is BBC Music Introducing. I mentioned it in the releasing, how to release your getting release ready video. Don't forget to upload your music to it, but don't also forget about the resources that are there through them. It's quite hidden on their website, I'll have to admit, but there's quite a lot of kind of resource in terms of support and videos in terms of how to make it in the music industry. But it obviously can also be a big source of support. Previously, pre-COVID, they ran a really great conference down in London. I think they're still looking at ways to do things like that. They did some panel discussions last year around and about. I think they did a really great one in York. So yeah, keep your eyes out for what BBC Music Introducing do as well, beyond just being somewhere to upload your music. And finally, I don't want to go all the way through this and not forget us, really, because obviously many people on this call will have kind of had support from us or kind of be getting support from us right now. We're always doing events, workshops around and about. We're kind of really enjoying going out and doing things in lots of different places at the minute with different focuses. We're going to be announcing quite a lot of stuff for sort of towards the end of the year shortly. We always have, if you're not kind of core support to us, we always have our one-to-one advice sessions where we're happy to kind of give support and guidance. You can book those through our website at any point to kind of have a chat with the team. And also, I keep mentioning this, and it feels every time we talk about it, it feels more relevant and useful to people. Is our Launchpad Plus offer. So, of course, one of the things that we sort of seem to have developed that works quite well and been received is this kind of really practical support for releasing and promoting. So again, if you are looking to do that and wanting support and a bit of a kind of someone to help you with it, don't forget that you can come to us to ask advice for that. And again, we're quite happy to kind of talk through the process, and if it makes sense to work more directly with us, then we can do that. And all these things are kind of obviously linked through the Launchpad website as well. That's about it. That's a bit of your whirlwind tour through different funders and so on. So I'm going to say thank you to anyone who's watching back and on the recording. I'm going to pause recording a minute, and there'll be one more talk as part of the series, which we'll do next week. So thank you very much for watching.